Hey, welcome back. It's Sarah from Roadworthy. It's time for another weekly reads. Pretty good week, actually. I have kind of a lot to talk about. So I'm trying to think of what I've been, I know what I've been up to. So our dryer broke. My husband and I we try and fix everything. And he was like, it's gonna be the thermal fuse. So trying to get the dryer apart to be able to access where the thermal fuse is has been a little bit of an adventure. So we thought we could access it through the front, and as we're like kind of doing yoga poses, to get in there, realized I think we kind of need to take the back off too, which taking the back off means taking the top off too. So it's just like growing arms and legs. The thermal fuse, of course, is like in the middle of the dryer. And of course, there's lint everywhere, right? So I have vacuumed up, I think, half a bag in the vacuum, vacuuming all of this lint. It's kind of satisfying, actually. So the thermal fuse actually just came. So later on today, that's what I'll be doing. In the meantime, so that's what sort of hijacked my week. But what have I read? Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. Sorry for the shine. This is almost like a crime thriller kind of a thing. I'm gonna put this down because it just looks terrible. So this is basically a fictionalized story based on Ted Bundy's attack on the Chi Omega sorority at Florida State University in Tallahassee. Ted Bundy is not mentioned in the book. He's not mentioned on the flap. And the story is told from the perspective of two women. One is Pamela, who is the president of the sorority, and the other is Ruth, she is involved in one of the disappearances that actually occurred here in the Seattle area. So I was expecting, again, kind of crime thrillery, and this definitely has elements of that, and it's super page turnery. But what's interesting that Jessica Knoll is really trying to do is illustrate just some of the misogyny and patriarchy that was present at the time in the United States that sort of perpetuated several of these murders, and I think that's probably what drew me to this book is I know a lot of people are very concerned about the glamorization of serial killers or people who commit these atrocious crimes against women, and I get that, but I think what's really interesting to me about these stories is what the heck is happening in the culture that when these men who are clearly not well, but this is how their pathology manifests itself in these horrible crimes against women. And that's a lot of what is in this book. So so again, Pamela, who's the president of the sorority, a lot of it is, so it starts with the break-in at the sorority, the crimes against the sorority. So 2 women were severely attacked and beaten, but survived, and 2 women actually were killed. So it's sort of that event, the immediate aftermath, and then following for up until Ted Bundy is arraigned in, I should say the defendant is arraigned in Florida a year-ish later. And so a lot of it is like the sorority girls trying to be the right victims. How do they mourn correctly? You know, she's like, come on, we got to go to church because of how that will look. You know, we've got to go outside and the press is there. Nobody cry, you know, so, and of course, then they were criticized for not being emotional enough. Then they were criticized for being hysterical, you know, so they couldn't mourn right. They couldn't be victims right. And there are just some interesting, she does a great job of just slipping in these little details, to just sort of convey what was happening. So at one point, Pamela is filling out some paperwork to be reimbursed from the state for some of the expenses incurred as victims. So you can imagine nobody kind of wanted to stay at the sorority house after that. So some of the women went home to their families. So she was trying to get travel expenses covered. Some of the women stayed in hotels. Can we get those expenses covered? You know, blah, 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 blah. And so she's going through the form, and here's the check boxes. And one of the check boxes is relocation fees due to sexual assault. And she's like, I don't know if I should check that box. And her boyfriend says, well, no one was technically sexually assaulted. And she's, and you don't want to give them an excuse to deny your request. And she's like, oh yeah, you're right. So she doesn't check that box, even though that's clearly like the appropriate box. So just, again, little details like that. You know, so for example, Pamela was the only eyewitness to the defendant's presence in the house. And so, you know, repeatedly she's asked, give a description. And she makes a comment, I always make sure to describe him as a little man because men hate to be described as little. So again, lots of just clever little details throughout this book, really, you know, laying out sort of the cultural barriers. The other thing that she sort of rips into quite a bit is, of course, Ted Bundy had this reputation as being smart and clever and charming. And she goes into, no, he wasn't. And a lot of those myths and stereotypes came about by the prosecutors and police to cover up the fact that they screwed up the investigation and allowed Ted Bundy to escape from prison twice before attacking Chi Omega. So anyway, just, I was not expecting very much from this book other than to be entertained. And I was actually very surprised that this book was way more interesting and thought-provoking than I was expecting. I listened to Fire Weather, A True Story from a Hotter World by John Vaillant. I think I might have heard about this book first from Lindy at Magpie Reads, but it's shown up on a couple of best of 2023 lists, and so I thought I would give it a try. This book is sort of what's described on the tin, that talking about fires in general and how weather and climate change is contributing to more severe fires, how fire season in Australia, in parts of California, are now considered year-round. You know, there's no longer a season. So talking about that, and then also talking about fire generating its own weather systems. When you get an intense, hot enough fire, it can generate tornadoes, and basically create its own weather systems. So he does go through that. It's sort of described on the tin. And he's using the 2016 Fort McMurray fire as sort of the example to talk about a lot of those phenomenon, and how horrible and unprecedented that fire was in Canadian history, and also fire history, really. So that part to me was interesting. But he also has long sections about Fort McMurray is where the Alberta tar sands are. So he goes through this long history about the tar sands, and how that became economically viable in the history of Fort McMurray, and again, just a lot of oil development history, and the petroleum industry, anyway, a lot. He also goes into sort of the history of climate science, and how people have been predicting global changes pretty much right as industrialization started. So in the 1850s, 1860s, you were already seeing people talk about the impact of carbon dioxide, increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and greenhouse effect had been described, and then some of the science, and then the petroleum industry initially being very on board with exploring this connection and validating, and to now, then becoming climate deniers and putting a ton of resources into convincing people that climate change is not happening. I did feel that Vaillant definitely had a little bit of an axe to grind, and a little bit perhaps using Fort McMurray as his example, as irony, here you're raping the earth for petroleum, and the earth is biting back, kind of a thing. I wouldn't say this felt neutral. And I thought some of these sections, about the bitumen industry, and, it was in again, the history of climate science, I thought was just a bit long-winded. But it was incredibly interesting to try and understand and appreciate fire a bit more. That was kind of interesting. So then I picked up a graphic novel here by Richard McGuire. This, I loved this. This totally reminded me of Northwoods. Just a wonderful compliment to Daniel Mason's book, because here basically is doing the exact same thing. It is giving you the history of a house through, you know, like the Ice Age on into the future. So on each page, you'll see little snippets about what was going on in this house at various points in time. So this is just a lovely, lovely example. So you've got, so the main picture is 1986 where she's vacuuming. And then you have over here, this is 1960, and he's in this box and he's ripping down old wallpaper, and he's down to the level of here in 1949 where this guy is putting up that wallpaper. So you just have little snippets. There's a wonderful little section of like, where are my glasses? And like, you know, here it is. Where are my glasses? You know, 1997. Where are my glasses? 1956. You know, where are my glasses? So, and it just kind of made me chuckle because, you know, I live in an old house too. Well, old for Seattle standards. But like, yeah, I think about, oh, wow, probably the phrase, where are my glasses, has been said many, many times throughout the history of this house. So, you know, again, there's just wonderful little things, you know, kids playing at various points in time. And, you know, anyway, this was just charming and delightful, you know, loved the art. But again, you could just, you know, whip through this baby. But again, just super charming and a wonderful companion to Daniel Mason's Northwoods. I also listened to Creep, Accusations and Confessions by Miriam Grub. Miriam is a Mexican-American writer, and this is a collection of personal essays. It was a little slow to get off the ground for me, maybe the first essay, but like once she got going, oh my God, I could not stop listening. She does read the audiobook, and she is talking about, she lives in California, so talking about just some of the pervasive racism in Mexico against Mexican Americans and migrants, and sort of Mexican Americans aren't really Americans, you know, they're Mexican, you know. Just, yeah, some of the stereotypes leveled against her. Oh, you know, yeah. She talks about sexual assault. Yeah, just graphically. She talks about domestic abuse graphically. But again, I think some of the things that she had to say on these topics were interesting, and I just found very insightful and very interesting. And again, as she was, you know, her experiences trying to separate from her abusive boyfriend, and not getting sort of the help and support he needed. You know, the you know, the sexual assault that she experienced, and she's had more than one incident. So talking about those, I mean, again, a very hard hitting, but very interesting. Would absolutely recommend. But again, be prepared. But very, very good. Very good. And I am interested in reading Mean, which is her first book, that apparently she was writing while in an abusive relationship. So she does talk about the writing of Mean. She, just as a little booktube aside, she talks about her takedown review of American Dirt by Janine Cummins that is quite great to read. Anyway, well worth it. And then the last thing that I picked up and DNF'd halfway through is Cousins by Aurora Venturini. I'm gonna say it's pronounced Venturini. She's Argentine, so I feel like I'm saying it like her name's Italian. But anyway, so this book, so she has written, I think they say over 30 novels, and this is the first of her novels to be translated into English, published this year, and she is deceased. This, and apparently all of her novels are a bit fringe. This one, Cousins, is about our narrator and her 3 cousins. So there's 4 cousins. Her aunts, her mother, her grandmother. So essentially this family, dysfunctional, poor family of women. There is an uncle who's named here and there, but it's really about these dysfunctional women. Our narrator is described, I think, by one of her aunts as a half-wit. Her sister, Bertina, is in a wheelchair. She is not able to communicate. And she goes into fairly graphic detail about bodily function throughout this. So like menstruation. She'll talk about her sister being disgusting because she drools and defecates and urinates at the dinner table. And again, goes into this quite graphically and goes into, you know, throughout this book, like, my sister is disgusting, and, you know, and she talks about like her cousins who also have issues. So, anyway, so very crass is kind of the best way I can describe this. Crass. She talks about, you know, one of the cousins is forced to have an abortion. There's sexual abuse that goes on in here. And again, all of this is just like, you know, anyway, so that, you know, that was okay. I can, you know, that was all right. But this gets to a point where she talks about she's too tired to use punctuation. And so suddenly we get into, a page that's one sentence, you know. and no commas. And it's very much jumping from topic to topic. And it just, for me as a reader, I find that exhausting. And it just got to be, and again, because her mind jumps from topic to topic, and having that all be in one sentence, like it just was too much for me. It made sense from a literary device perspective why this narrator, like why she was using that for this narrator. Totally get it. I just couldn't, I ran out of steam with it. And again, this isn't that long of a book. Where this started to get interesting though, is our narrator is a painter. And so what's interesting is she starts to convey her feelings and her responses and interpretations of these events through her painting. And she starts to sell her paintings, and sort of the power dynamics in the family change when she suddenly is starting to bring home real money to support this poor family. And again, that was about halfway through, and that's where I DNF'd, because I just, that wasn't interesting enough for me to be compelled to keep going and overcome the lack of punctuation. If that doesn't bother you, you know, this might be worth picking up. But again, a very, very crass, a lot of bodily function. Just saying. So that's sort of what I read this week. So it was actually pretty good, and I've started on some things that I'm excited about. So, you know, what do I have to, my holiday shopping is done. You know, I've got nothing to complain about. So, hope you all are well and reading some good things, and I'll catch you next time. See ya.